Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome to the Auckland Unitarian Church. Welcome to people from all faiths and from all secular ways of life. Welcome to people who are visitors today. I'd especially like to welcome my wife Marion, who is visiting here today. And welcome to all people who are passing through or looking for a spiritual home. We hope you'll join us afterwards over a cup of tea or coffee. I'm a fairly new member of this church, have been coming here for 3 years, and I'm even more recent as a newcomer to the worship team. So I'd like to thank the leaders and members who were here before me, a whole team of them going back 115 years. I have often been inspired by your inclusiveness and your dedication to justice, and so I hope that will happen again today for all of us. Well, my opening words are taken from Scientific American magazine from May this year. And one of the articles is written by a woman who was a scientist in Siberia for many years. And she said, at the beginning of her article, "The animal runs toward me, its curly tail wagging, and its loving eyes full of joy. It jumps up into my arms and nuzzles my face like a dog. But it is not a dog, it is a fox that looks and behaves much like a dog. This animal is part of an experiment to find how humans may have transformed wolves into the first dogs, and at the same time, the dogs may have transformed humans into a new kind of friendship." But it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness. Better to let its bright light show where you stand, for its glow will melt the dark night like the coming of a new dawn, and hope will be born from that small flame in your hand. I saw a surprising Facebook post a few weeks ago from my oldest daughter Karen. It was paying a tribute to Auntie Phil. Now, I didn't know she had an Auntie Phil, so I thought it must have been one of her husband's aunties, and so I didn't reply. And then a few days later, I got another Facebook post from my youngest daughter Nikki, who lives near Levin, and she was asking, could I pick her up from the airport in a couple of days' time to take her to Auntie Phil's funeral in Auckland. And I was embarrassed because by now I had guessed who Auntie Phil might be, but I wasn't sure and didn't like to admit I didn't know. So I did some Google searching and found it was, in fact, my ex-sister-in-law. Have you ever heard of an ex-sister-in-law? She was my former wife's sister. And I also found out by looking up in the death notices that her husband had died a few years ago, and the eldest son had died a few years before that. He was a whole family of people whose lives I had dropped out of by neglect when my first marriage broke up. I remembered that 2 of her children used to call me Uncle David back then, but neither I nor they had made any contact since then. And I wondered how they would feel if I went to their mother's funeral. Well, I thought my daughter Nikki assumed that I was still part of that family, and if she was prepared to repair that bridge after all those years, then surely I ought to build the bridge as well and go with her to Auntie Phil's funeral. And it turned out to be a very moving experience. I knew about half of the people who were there, and we all greeted each other like long-lost friends, which we were. I remember one man who I had known from way back, who was now in a wheelchair, and he hadn't seen several of his children for years. I could share his sadness. But there were happy reunions. Another man introduced himself to me and said, "Do you remember you married us?" Well, I did once he said it, but I had forgotten it. I had married him and his wife 50 years ago. It must be their golden wedding about now. And their wedding had been in that very same church. I never was minister of that church. I was ministering in other parts of the country, but I had come back to that church to take their wedding. When I met his wife shortly afterwards, I joked about it to her. I said, "I've just been reminded I married you about 50 years ago." And she joked back and she said, "Well, when you left the ministry, we were wondering if our marriage would still be valid." I said, "So maybe you've been living in sin all these years." I had not only lost touch with many of my family members, I had lost touch with many of my church friends, because I used to be a member at that church until 20 years ago, and many of those people remembered me. But when my marriage broke up, the minister asked me to leave that church, and so I did. It was a cruel thing for her to say, but maybe it was realistic. She was being sympathetic for my wife. But now all that was past, they all remembered me, and it was all very friendly. And all this shows how lax I have been in keeping up with past friends. But I pass this story on to you in case some of you have slipped into that situation, or in case you know other people who have quite a small circle of friends and family. Even good friends can drift apart for a number of reasons, sometimes just by moving to another town. So it was an eye-opener for me. Well, now that very same week, another couple in our extended family split up, and many people were in shock and giving support to them. But after a week or so, Marion and I realised that we were only keeping touch with one of the two ex-partners. And we thought, why are we not still family with her? And we rang her up and said, "You are still family to us." So those are two examples of broken families and how they are healing a little. Broken family number 3 is a story from the Bible. Last time I took a service here, the Christian lectionary for that day was very appropriate for the sermon, and it's even more appropriate today because today's Bible reading from the book of Genesis is about the story of Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It's the story, the reading is about the climax of that story where Joseph and his 11 brothers have been separated for many years, and Joseph eventually meets up with them, and they had had a major bust-up when he first left. But that was all 20 years ago, and in the reading for today, Joseph and his brothers got together again. Now, not everybody will know the story of Joseph. Have any of you seen the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? I've seen it, quite a lot of you. But those of you who haven't, I'll tell you the story because it's a very moving story. Joseph's father Jacob had 2 wives. His older wife Leah had 10 sons, and the other wife Rachel had only 1 son who was Joseph. Now Rachel was Joseph's favourite wife, and so Joseph was his favourite son, and he spoiled him rotten. And he gave Joseph his coat of many colours as a way of saying, "You are the greatest, you are my favourite son." It was a very nice present for Joseph, but a terrible present for all the other sons who learnt that they were not their father's favourite. This led to the brothers being furious with Joseph and trying to kill him by throwing him into a pit. And this led on to Joseph being rescued from the pit by some nomads who were on their way to Egypt. So they took him there and sold him as a slave. And that led to an even worse disaster when his master's wife tried to seduce him, and he got blamed for it and thrown in jail. So Joseph's life was going from bad to worse for years. But from that point, his life turned a corner. He was still in jail, but he started interpreting other people's dreams, and he kept on getting it right. One dreamer was Pharaoh's cupbearer, and Joseph said this man's dream meant he was going to be freed from jail and would go back to being a servant in Pharaoh's household. The other dreamer was Pharaoh's baker, who thought, wow, that man had good luck in his dream. I've just had a dream. And he told Joseph what it was. And Joseph said, I'm afraid your dream is not so good. It means you're going to be killed. And the music Joseph shows all these scenes very closely, rubbing in the sarcasm. In this scene with the baker in prison, Joseph says, don't rely on all I said I saw. It's just that I have not been wrong before. and both those dreams came true. Now Joseph, I forgot to mention, when he was still with his family, after he got this fantastic coat, he started having dreams, and in all his dreams, he was the top dog, and all his brothers were bowing down to him. And then he had another dream, and his father and mother were bowing down to him. And that was when he told his brothers these dreams, that was what made them really, really angry. But anyway, while Joseph was still in prison, Pharaoh started having dreams that frightened him. And the cupbearer told Pharaoh he knew of a man in jail who could interpret the dreams and say what they meant. So Joseph was brought out of jail to see Pharaoh. And he explained to Pharaoh that his dreams were about good years following on bad. He said it meant that Egypt was going to have 7 years of rich harvests, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph told Pharaoh, "You need to find a wise person who can steer you through this crisis." Now, you don't need to figure out that the wise person was Joseph himself, and he became Pharaoh's prime minister. He ordered all the Egyptians to store up food during the 7 good years, and he distributed it to the rest of the country in the 7 years of famine. And it's a great story, a good coming out of a series of disasters. But there was a bigger surprise still to come. When the famine came to Egypt, it also came to Canaan, where Joseph's brothers were still living. They thought that Joseph was dead, and when they heard there was lots of food being handed out in Egypt, they went there and started begging. And of course, the man who was handing out all this food was Joseph, who they had tried to kill. And they made their begging speech to him and didn't recognize him. And Joseph recognized them. In fact, this is what he had dreamed about all those years ago, about his brothers begging at his feet, and how it was true. And if he had been a nasty man, he would have thought, this is my chance for revenge. And the brothers were very afraid that he would kill them for trying to kill him all those years ago. But instead of revenge, Joseph was super kind to them. And I'll read you the words he said. "You intended to do harm to me, but God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. So have no fear, I myself will provide for you and your children." So it was a family reunion to end all reunions. Joseph's 10 brothers came to live with him in Egypt, plus his younger brother Benjamin, who he had never seen because he was born after Joseph left. And his father Jacob came, and they all lived happily ever after in Egypt. It's a beautiful story, but you wonder, is it too good to be true? I read a Jewish commentary which said none of the stories of the Jewish patriarchs was true. There were no tribes of Israel back in those days. The tribes probably didn't start to get together until someone around the time of the King David, about 1,000 years later. But there is, underneath this piece of fiction, there is a true story that I heard of from Christian commentators. They said there were 2 groups of wandering tribes who came to live in the land of Israel. There was one lot who started off in what is now Iraq, and they migrated west to what is now Israel, and their story is summarized in the legend of Abraham and Sarah. So that story is it sounds like a story of just one family, but it was probably thousands of people migrating from Iraq to Israel. And this theory says there was another group of tribes who lived in Egypt, and they too migrated to Israel, and their story is captured in the story of Moses. And all sorts of miracles are told about, which are probably not true at all, but it probably is true that some tribes did come from Egypt and lived in Israel. So the story, the puzzle of those stories is, here they are the 2 stories. One of them is the book of Genesis. It's the story of the Iraqi tribes. The other is the story of Exodus, which is about the other tribes. Which is the real story? Where did their ancestors really come from? And the answer, according to these theologians, is the 2 stories got added together many years later by editors who said the tribes who came from Iraq moved to Israel, and then they moved from Israel to Egypt, where they could get rescued again and go back. And so Joseph's story was invented just to link the two stories together. He was the missing link. He was papering over the cracks. They were not really tribes at all. But by the time they told their story, they were indeed a family. So it was not Joseph who united the tribes. It was some editors living maybe 1,000 years later. And that story is such a strong story that it keeps the Jews still together. A very valuable story. So there's a story of reconciliation in all of these stories. But the Jewish story has led on to many unpleasant stories. After the Jews claimed that this was their chosen land, the Christians came and said that was their story, their history. And Muslims came and invaded Israel, and it made it their story. And Christians tried to kick the Muslims out and make it a Christian story again. And it's still going on, isn't it? It's still warring stories. And I'm not going to try and say what's the answer to the Middle East, but I'd suggest that this is almost a universal situation of countries all around the world making their stories, some of which are true and some of which are legends, and they have with them, I hope, some stories of bust-ups and some stories of reconciliation. We in New Zealand have a story of Maori migrants to New Zealand and European migrants, and of them meeting and being all sorts of messes, and we are still retelling that story and trying to reconcile those two. And we have other people from other countries, from the Pacific, and migrants from all over the world, some of them refugees, and they too are becoming part of our story. And sometimes people are saying that too many of them, we don't want them to come. And so Jacinda Ardern the other day was saying we need to take a pause. There are too many migrants and we must try and cut it down for a while. And other people would not agree with that. But anyway, it's a story. The whole world is really a series of stories of families being split and families joining up. And it's the same story. We have inherited this messy story here in New Zealand. We didn't create it, but we have to deal with it. And I think we need to pick leaders who've got visions of reconciliation. It's the same principle that Joseph talked about, with different details, bringing good outcomes out of broken homes. Now, for a meditation, I suggest you might like to think of another saying that Russian scientist made. There's a Russian novel, Anna Karenina, which is about unhappy homes. And it begins with these words, happy homes are all alike, but unhappy homes are unhappy in different ways. This Russian scientist disagreed with that, and she said, happy homes are all happy in different ways. And she knew that because she was making a happy family with all those dogs. So I'd like to think of those thoughts. Happy homes, what makes them happy, and unhappy homes.